her. Iowa and Ohio are the toughest.
Hey, did you see these characters with the maps? You know, the Electoral College. So about a month ago, there's, oh, it's a very small path for Trump. Today I'm watching, oh, wow. Now they're looking at all these paths.
With all due respect to Donald Trump, he can take our maps when you pry them from our cold, dead fingers. For two guys with so many maps, it's really amazing how often we are so directionless and lost. Tonight on the show, we are going to tell you the tale that we like to call The Billionaire and the Beauty Queen. This is part 2. Donald J. Trump and his presidential campaign are still dealing with the fallout from his fat shaming of the 1996 Miss Universe pageant winner, Alicia Machado, who spent the past 24 hours telling her story in interviews with CNN, Fox News, and The Today Show.
What were the names that he called you? Miss Piggy, Miss Housekeeping, Miss Eating Machine. All to your face? Yes, all the time. I know what I left with him, and he knows too. And he was really aggressive. He was really rude. He was a bad person with me. And that is the story that I need to share. For my community.
When you said
we can't accept more insults for my Latin community. No more. I need to share my story. I think I can open a few eyes. I can maybe change a few minds. Then, you know, I don't think this person is the right person then can be a president.
Mark, we will talk about how the media has been covering this story in just a moment. But my question for you at this hour is whether this story is accelerating or finally starting to simmer down.
The Trump campaign, I think, could be forgiven for thinking, well, this will just go away. If we don't comment on it, it will go away. Because that's happened in the past when Trump's had these flaps. Some of them have lingered, but not as dominant stories, kind of background stuff the Clinton people push. The reason why I think they may be wrong and that this may linger as a news story in a pretty hot way is we're in a different phase of the campaign. This happened in the debate. It didn't happen at a rally. Didn't happen in an offhanded remark to Fox or in an interview. This happened in a debate in such a high-profile way. And she is someone who, for whatever flaws she might have, what Trump said about her is going to resonate with a lot of people. So I think it's still moving, and I think the Trump campaign believes they can ignore it. They may be wrong.
You know, I said yesterday on the show that I thought, you know, it's just nuts to insult someone in a way that has such a resonance with so many people. You know, we learned yesterday 85 million people watched that debate. Let's say that's 40 million women. Virtually every one of those 85 million people knows someone who, all of us, right, who have dealt with dealt with their weight issues.
Certainly the ones who know me feel that way.
Well, we've dealt with weight issues, or we've had someone in our family who's dealt with a weight issue. There are people who have eating disorders. There are people who've been bullied. These are like issues that are not political, abstract policy issues or even abstract political issues. These are like the grist of the culture, of the kind of things people talk about over their dinner table every day. And that is a very dangerous terrain to insult many, 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 many millions of people in that way, which is why I think you're right. I think she's come across, I think, quite sympathetically in most of her media interviews. I've not seen all of them, but the ones I've seen, she's come across very sympathetically. She's come across like she's hurt. She has a right to be hurt. I don't know if the Trump campaign is ever going to apologize to her, but I'll tell you, you said it yesterday that they should. I think today, even more than yesterday, it would be smart for them to shut this down by apologizing.
And to paraphrase Donald Trump, I don't care if she went out on Fifth Avenue and shot someone. What he said about her and to her was wrong and rude and insensitive.
Right.
And I think a lot of people are going to say it that way. And I'll just say again, the press is not going to drop this. The Clinton campaign is not going to drop it. I'm not saying it's going to dominate. I'm not saying it's going to cost them the election. But they're wrong to think that at this phase, in a high-profile thing, the highest-profile thing, like a debate, that this is just another person Trump insulted and who cares.
A lot of people think Donald Trump is a bully. And you can be mean to your political opponents. You can say a lot of things about him and no one really cares because that's what's expected of politicians. But when you start bullying private citizens, whether it's a Gold Star family or a judge in Indiana, from Indiana. You're in a different terrain.
I'll just say one more thing.
No nominees do this.
The dominant meme right now in this campaign is Trump and Trump particularly, but also his campaign are not competent, that they're not performing competently because the debate was not handled competently. Now the prism through which this is being seen is incompetence, failure to put it down. All right. As we said, the Trump campaign has largely been shrugging off the Machado story. Last night, Trump spokeswoman Katrina Pearson was on Megyn Kelly's set during that Machado interview we showed you just a little bit earlier. Here was Pearson's immediate reaction.
I think if we look at the context, we are talking about beauty pageants. These individuals who participate in these contests have a weight clause in their contract.
But you know, he has called some women fat pigs. He's constantly evaluating women based on a number. They're a 7, they're a 10. I mean, he's very in the body shape of women.
Well, absolutely. Mr. Trump owned a beauty pageant, and that's where some of that comes from. That is also entertainment. That is also television. When you look at the woman, for example, like his wife and his daughters, they say he treats everyone the same. So we can't just pull out one section of women and say he only does this to women. He will criticize those who criticizes him.
Well, he says you can't be a 10 if you're flat-chested. He hasn't said the equivalent of a man.
Well, I think everyone has their own opinion on what a 10 is.
Everyone has their own opinion. Conservatives have been trying to discredit Machado by digging up stories from her past in Venezuela involving a boyfriend, a shooting, and claims that she threatened a judge. Rush Limbaugh today called her a porn star, alluding to a report that she may have appeared in an adult film. The drive-by media, as Limbaugh calls our ilk, have, for the most part, been giving this story plenty of airtime for the last 48 hours. Fox News, however, different story. They don't report on this one, so you can't really decide. Yes, the Fair and Balanced Network covered this story last night, but today they couldn't seem to find the time, even as other TV outlets led with it. Fox did somehow find time to cover these important stories.
Oh, have you seen this story? A marriage proposal turning into a major ordeal last night at Yankee Stadium.
If you went to bed a Capricorn, you may now be a Sagittarius. That is according to NASA. You may have always had a different sign and just never knew it.
Where this monster storm is hitting and where it's heading.
Look who got caught in the carpool lane. Yep, his ticket is going to be huge.
A new book on the long unsolved murder of John Benet Ramsey.
He's been obsessed with the idea of getting humans on Mars, and not just getting humans on Mars, but actually colonizing Mars. Meanwhile, let's bring in Herman Cain.
All right, there were a few rare instances in which Machado did come up on Fox today, but it was quickly smothered. Watch, for instance, what happened on Fox and Friends when a focus group with 5 mothers talking about Monday's debate. The host, Ainsley Earhart, did not bring up Machado, but when a woman in the focus group did, she was immediately cut off.
When you go on national television the morning after the debate and attack someone and call them a pig and threaten, insult her for having gained weight, it is an insult to all women. It's about values and the values of this nation.
At least for the gander at night, Hillary basically was a verbal assault of insults. That wasn't positive for her.
So, John, will the apparent effort by conservative media either to defend Trump on this or ignore the story effectively discourage the Trump campaign from changing course?
One of the things that is true about a lot of Republican politicians, and particularly Republican presidential nominees, is that eventually they start, as the campaign gets for longer and longer, for a variety of reasons, they get sucked into the conservative media cocoon, and they stop talking to anybody outside that cocoon. It is understandable. You want the praise, you don't want the criticism, you want the easy questions, not the hard questions, but it is not to your political benefit to do that. And in this case, I think if Donald Trump is just looking at Fox News and reading Breitbart and looking at conservative blogs, he doesn't understand what kind of resonance this story is having out in the real world. And it may be lulling him into thinking, hey, this is no big deal, when it's a big deal.
Steve Bannon and Dave Bossie, and to some extent, Kellyanne Conway, are in that cocoon. That's the world in which they come from. And if they think they're getting a realistic appraisal of how this issue is playing, not just in the media, but with real people. Every reporter I know is being asked about this by people who aren't involved in politics. They're kidding themselves, and they're doing Trump a disservice. And if Trump's flying around on Trump Force One, watching Fox and saying, hey, they're not talking about it, therefore I don't need to grapple with this, insane.
We watched the same thing happen, at the end of 2012 when Mitt Romney and Paul Ryan started to think that Benghazi was a hugely important story because they were only talking about it on Fox News and on the rope lines, and they were like, well, everyone's talking about Benghazi. They weren't. It was like the polar opposite, the mirror image of this scenario.
And I'll tell you, the other thing is, like, Fox can ignore it all they want. Right. But it is getting huge play everywhere else. Yep. And it's one thing to be in the Fox cocoon and the Rush cocoon when you're trying to win the Republican nomination. But when you're trying to win a general election and you're trying to reach women in the Philadelphia suburbs,
even if you think that the rest of the media is liberally biased, it does you no good not to pay attention to what's going on out there, because those supposedly biased networks are reaching millions of voters you need.
I've often talked about liberal bias in the media. Covering and caring about a story where the Republican nominee insulted a woman for her weight. Nothing to do with liberal bias.
Yes, nothing to do with
nothing to do with liberal bias. And the Fox will continue clearly to ignore this. And if that makes Trump think the story's going away, I say again, it's wrong.
It's like a bunch of monkeys with their hands over their ears and eyes and mouth and all that stuff. It's not good. All right, when we come back, Bernie Sanders lends Hillary Clinton a hand in New Hampshire today, and Michelle Obama hits the Pennsylvania campaign trail. We will talk about their millennial hopes and dreams right after this.
What's up, millennials? We've talked on this program about how many of you are still lukewarm about Hillary Clinton, which is why today Clinton visited the college town of Durham, New Hampshire to talk more about student debt with the very coolest white-haired dude in all of politics, her former nomination rival, Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders. Lately, we've noticed a new line of millennial persuasion that's being used by Clinton and her team. Their concerns young voters might either vote for Libertarian candidate Gary Johnson or Green Party's Jill Stein, or they might not turn out to vote at all. So amid attempts to inspire young voters to consolidate behind Clinton, the Democratic nominee and her highest profile surrogates are now trying to also kind of scare them, saying that doing anything but voting for Clinton would lead to a Trump presidency. Two people were out promoting that message today. The First Lady, Michelle Obama, on the campaign trail in Philadelphia, and her husband, President Obama, during a radio interview that aired on the Steve Harvey Morning Show.
If you don't vote, that's a vote for Trump. If you vote for a third-party candidate who's got no chance to win, that's a vote for Trump.
If you vote for someone other than Hillary, or if you don't vote at all, then you are helping to elect Hillary's opponent. And the stakes are far too high to take that chance. Too high. Remember, it's not about voting for the perfect candidate. There is no such person.
So, John, is this a tactic that will turn millennials out and turn them out to vote for Hillary Clinton?
Well, there's a version of it that I think, it's got to be a two-pronged thing. She's got to talk in a way, and maybe part of the things she talked about with Sanders today, talking about her college affordability plans, making people aware that she and Sanders on a really key issue for a lot of millennials are joined at the hip. That's important on the positive side. Some of this, raising the stakes of the election and trying to make clear to millennials that they have skin in this game and that things could be worse from the Democratic point of view if Trump wins, is going to be part of the message mix there, I think. But it can't be all of it.
I think it'll work with some from the millennials I have talked to who were wildly enthusiastic about Sanders. Sanders was a different thing. They didn't like him because he was a Democrat. Right. They didn't like him because he was a politician. They didn't like him because they had long followed his career. They liked his authenticity and his ideas and his passion and his anti-establishment sensibility. I think getting them to vote for Clinton is going to be difficult. If they were forced to vote, I think a lot of them would give up Johnson and Stein, but I think a lot of them won't turn out right now. I'm not saying it's a done deal, but on the current state of affairs, I think this could be the key thing in the whole election. It
is the crucial question. All that but millennial vote that's parked with Gary Johnson, what portion, very little of it I think will go to Trump, but what portion of it goes to Clinton in the end and what portion of it stays home is really, I mean, in some of these states where Johnson especially is up in the 10, 11, 12%, could make the difference in the state. Colorado is one example. There are others.
For a lot of them, obviously, I mean, I talked to some millennials in Florida last week, and I said to them, you realize two things, that Bernie Sanders really wants you to vote for Hillary Clinton, and that Sanders and Clinton are almost indistinguishable on issues, according to both of them.
Especially issues you care about.
Yeah, and all five of them were fully unmoved. In the end, they said, yeah, maybe, but they didn't, there was no light bulb. There was no notion of, well, of course, I'll do that in the end. It was, maybe, probably, I don't like Trump.
It's funny, even though Sanders is older than Hillary Clinton, he was new. Yeah. And his newness was what was attractive. Yeah. He seemed like a new force in politics. Even millennials who don't know that much about Hillary Clinton think of her as the past. Yeah, and that's a hard thing to get out of.
They don't love Trump, but they just think of Clinton as a totally different species than Sanders. And Sanders is what got them engaged in politics. And to some extent, President Obama got some of them engaged. But as David Plouffe and others have pointed out, a whole new wave of millennials who didn't vote for Barack Obama.
And they like Sanders.
They like Sanders.
His unconventionality and the fact that he wanted to break the system. They want to break the system, too. Hillary, even when she agrees with Sanders, doesn't want to break the system over her knee.
That I've said they must keep at this with the Obamas and Bernie Sanders and everything else.
All right. Okay, finally, we have to turn to some sad news from last night. After a distinguished career in politics, former Israeli President Shimon Peres died at the age of 93. His funeral will be held in Israel on Friday and is expected to be attended by many mourning world leaders. Among those paying their respects in person will be Bill Clinton, Vice President Biden, and President Obama, who released a heartfelt statement that read in part, quote, "There are a few people who we share this world with who can change the course of human history, not just through their role in human events, but because they expand our moral imagination and force us to expect more of ourselves." My friend Shimon was one of those people. Mark?
More popular in some ways in America than in Israel. He did in Israel an extraordinarily courageous and tough thing. He went against public opinion and fought to kind of normalize the notion of negotiations to try to bring about peace. He got the Oslo Accords to be accepted as a touchstone, as a framework, and he did a difficult thing. He went against the public view to try to change the public view, and the peace process, as tattered as it is, wouldn't be anything like where it has gone if it weren't for him.
He, had a hugely historic role in establishing the state of Israel. He fought for Israel's independence, and then tried to dream of peace. And it's interesting that even his staunchest foes, who were, he was a liberal, a guy like Bibi Netanyahu, who doesn't agree with Shimon Peres about much, they all admired his historic place in the history of Israel, his commitment to the state of Israel, and even those who really disagreed with him about the prospects for peace and how to get there admired the fact that he was a realist dreamer, that kind of combination of being hard-eyed but also still aspiring.
Yeah. All right. He will be missed, and it's going to be quite a funeral for him with a lot of world leaders. Up next, we'll talk to the New York Times media man, Jim Rutenberg, about the Machado controversy, the debate this week, and a whole lot more right after this.
Welcome back. Our next guest is the media columnist for what Donald Trump likes to call the failing and failed New York Times. That is Jim Rutenberg. Ooh.
Oh.
Good to see you.
How are you?
So tell me about what you think of this 24 hours of coverage. Yesterday we had debate coverage that was basically about who won, who lost. Now we have a different storyline. Just talk about where the debate fallout story is going from a media point of view.
I mean, it's going in like 5 different directions, right? We have a continued fallout over a fattest comment about a former beauty queen. We have questions about whether he's going to buckle down and prepare more for his next debate. There are some gender questions about whether, how the coverage went for Hillary Clinton. So it's like the debate did not disappoint. And then there's huge ratings news. So the debate just delivered more than I've ever seen in my time covering politics and media.
What, besides the beauty queen storyline, what other storylines do you think come out of the debate that dominate? For instance, your paper's got a big story on debate prep.
Right.
Whether he debates. Is that a big deal, do you think?
I think debate prep this year becomes more than just like a process story, and more of the inside. It actually says something. I think Hillary Clinton, in her seemingly prepared remarks, set this up of, I'm not only preparing for the debate, I'm prepared for the president.
I like the fact you called it seemingly prepared.
Seemingly prepared? I do not know such things.
I think Jen Palmieri told us it was prepared, but she said it was Hillary Clinton's line.
Okay, so a planned remark, yeah. But it clearly landed the way that the campaign is embracing it. And
if you can't prepare for the debate, how are you going to prepare to be president?
Yeah, and I think that they found that to be a winning argument, and I have a feeling the Trump campaign felt the same way, which is why they're talking about changing the way he prepares for the next one. And I don't think that's a gimmick, and I don't think that's such a talking point. I think they mean it.
So all day long today, in the context of Alicia Machado, there's been stories that have seeped into British tabloids and into the conservative media sphere that have been negative about her past. We referenced them glancingly at the beginning of the show. Have you seen thus far any mainstream non-right outlets that have picked those up? And do you anticipate that they will if they haven't already?
I haven't seen anyone pick it up and run with it the same way. I do envision it, being maybe graph 18 if there's yet another story about this tomorrow morning. But does the Trump campaign want another story about this tomorrow morning? Because I don't know, having the candidate fight with a third party, he's not focusing on the things that people thought he did well on the debate. Trade, jobs.
Right.
So
press loves a winner, right? That's one of the biases. Clinton comes out of the debate as a winner. I haven't seen many negative stories about Hillary Clinton since the debate, about anything.
Right.
A lot of negative stories about Trump. Is that bad practice on the part of the media? Should we not basically say she won the debate, so no more investigative stories, no more asking her about her emails, et cetera?
Right, absolutely not. But there's been this, I think what everyone has to do, and we've had to do this all campaign, is take a deep breath. I mean, before this debate, the hype was, this is going to change the dynamic of the race. And nobody's really feeling that right now today.
Right.
Maybe a couple days, some polls, we'll see. So I think, everything has to be status quo. Everyone's got to just calm down a little bit. Do your job, stick to the basics.
Well, but again, should part of our job be saying just because she won the debate doesn't mean that every story about Trump has to be sort of tilted in a negative direction and all the stories about her have to be tilted in a positive direction?
It doesn't, and I don't think it will.
Yeah.
Because it's what
But you agree it's happening now, right?
It feels that way, but the debate only is it was 2 days. How many days? What day is today?
The debate was like 5 days ago.
Not quite.
Today's Wednesday. The debate was Monday. I mean, we're into 2 news cycles. I just think, again, I would say this if she was on the other foot. It's just like you win the debate and suddenly you get get out of jail free card for at least 48 hours now.
Right, but I don't think that's going to. I don't like making predictions. I predict that will not last.
The pendulum will swing back.
Yeah, or hopefully it'll swing to the proper
center
place.
And stop.
Yes.
True or false? Donald Trump is an unusually media savvy candidate.
The most media savvy I've ever seen in my lifetime.
Okay, so true.
True.
Yes. With blind spots.
So what is it about Trump, given that we know he didn't prepare much for the debate, but he blew some of the most elementary TV elements of it, like not seeming to understand what the split screen would do, not seeming to get the things that he always seemed to get so well before with the kind of almost a TV producer's eye. What happened? How does one explain that?
I wonder if shockingly, was he a little bit nervous? When you know that the audience is going to be that high, maybe he was human in that, and he was a little nervous. I also think that there's been so little consequence to him getting basic things wrong that he could get right in other situations. So maybe he just thought he could amble through and it would be okay. And part of what's made him compelling this year has been the sort of hot mess quality that sometimes takes over.
Liberals are going to kill you on Twitter for saying Trump was human.
I said maybe.
Okay, good point. Yep.
Okay.
Thank you, Jim.
I thought you still had one more question.
Is that my fault?
Oh my God. I thought I was waiting for Howard to step in.
I'll never be on this show again.
That's it. You're done. Get the hook for Rudenberg. Thank you for coming in. You were great. When we come back, we'll give you a threesome that you will never forget. Democratic strategist Mark Penn, Republican strategist Dan Senor, and Trump advisor Boris Epshteyn are live on this set, all three of them, right after this.
We've got a super boffo lineup right here in this studio. Joining us now, Boris Epshteyn, a senior advisor to the Trump campaign, Republican strategist, and Romney Ryan advisor, Dan Senor, and former Clinton campaign pollster and chief strategist, the Mark Penn. Gentlemen, delighted to have you all here. Boris,
Mark Penn.
I want to start with you. I want to show you a clip of Alicia Machado from CNN last night.
He was really rude with me. He was, he tried to destroy my self-esteem, and now I'm a voice in the Latin community.
As a person, as a human, as a man, a sensitive man that I know you are, how do you feel about that?
So that's a personal thing that Ms. Machado is choosing to do, and you know, apparently she has some disagreement with Mr. Trump. She's been trying to smear him for a long time now, and really it's none of my business. I'm not going to weigh in on it too much. That's between her and him. There's some things in her background that are a bit questionable, but again, I'll leave those to be out there.
But what he said to her isn't in dispute. It's on video. A lot of it's on videotape. So
again, you know, she chose to participate in the pageant. They had they had these interactions, and again, I don't think it matters. And frankly, I don't think it matters to the American people, the voters. They don't care about the interaction from 20 years ago or 17 years ago. They care about the economy, national security, on and on and on. They care about the women that he's employed, about Kellyanne Conway, who's our campaign manager. So I think the left is trying to portray Mr. Trump as somehow this monster, but this one woman is that's her personal.
But this wasn't 15 years ago. This was 2 days ago. He went on national television the morning after the debate and attacked her for gaining weight.
No, he was telling the story.
And he accused her of gaining weight.
He didn't accuse her of gaining weight. He was talking about what happened 17 years ago.
He said she was the worst contestant they had to deal with because she gained a lot of weight. That's what he said.
No,
that is what he said.
What he said.
That is literally what he said.
Verbatim, that's not true.
So what did he say?
What he said.
He talked about other reasons that she wasn't a great contestant, how she was difficult to deal with. Again, we're talking about.
Did he talk about her weight?
We're talking about a tiny issue here.
Really?
Do you really think anybody in Ohio, Pennsylvania, or Florida is going to vote on this? Absolutely not.
But you do agree he did talk about her weight.
He mentioned that as part of the overall issue.
It's a big problem.
With her as a,
let me ask you
as a contestant.
Let me ask you real quickly.
So much?
Well, I think you learn a lot in these situations about temperament. And it's striking to me that the morning after the debate, that didn't go that well for him, his immediate response is to attack a private citizen for her weight. I think that's a window into his
If you were a Trump advisor, would you say, don't talk about it, it will go away, or address it?
I'd say your temperament is the #1 issue holding you back from being president. Just say you and her had a disagreement, move on. I'm here to talk about taxes today and my tax cut plan.
Right.
And anything but that, and I've been through a lot of crises and a lot of effects. Anything with that is a huge mistake for anybody out there. All it does is bring his temperament into play. And that's what he did.
He went out there.
Temperament and character. It speaks to his character also.
He made a comment, but that was yesterday morning. But now the media wants to run with the narrative. Obviously, it's being pushed by the Clinton campaign. If you look at Mr. Trump's career, if you look at his career empowering women, again, Kellyanne Conway, our campaign manager, which the two of you know well, been a guest of this show. I think what Ms. Machado is saying is simply not borne out by the truth about Mr. Trump. And again, let's talk about Mr. Trump's proposals. Talk about the child care plan, which is revolutionary, really, for a Republican to want to have paid maternity leave, to want to make sure that women are able to seek work.
I don't want to dwell on this. I just want to say, just to be clear, I'm as critical of the media and how they cover Republicans as anybody. But in fairness, it was Trump who said on Fox and Friends that she had a weight problem. The media didn't say that. He said that.
Go back to the New York Times from around that time. They said the same thing. And she herself said the same thing about herself in the New York Times. She said, well, I was.
Again, even the fact that you're discussing it and litigating
I want to move on. I would love to move on.
Mark, give us your overall sense of the race in the wake of the debate, looking at national battleground state polls. How do you see her chances versus his chances right now?
Look, this race was getting within the margin of error, and the debate was going to be the decisive event. And I always thought she would come out kind of very strong, clearly understanding the issues, ready to be president. I think she came out more aggressive than I expected. And I think that aggressiveness against Trump worked. Because the question was she aggressiveness to go toe-to-toe with Trump? Yes. She basically thumped him. She baited him, thumped him. And so even though in the first half hour they were candidate to candidate, in the next hour, she basically thumped and baited him, and he kind of lost it. And I think everybody agrees with that.
Just real quick, yes, no. Do you agree with David Plouffe that her chances of winning the presidency are 100%? It's amazing. That's what David Plouffe said.
I saw him say that on.
No one's chances of anything in this world are 100%.
Wow, that's some spin from Plouffe.
Boris, let me just ask this question real simple, straightforward question. You got another big debate coming up. There's a lot of stories about people in your world talking about what should be different. Does Donald Trump need to prepare more for the next debate, or did he prepare sufficiently for the first debate?
He prepares sufficiently for the debate, right? And he will be absolutely ready for the next debate, and he'll be absolutely ready for the last debate. And we are. I want to be clear, though. You're saying that you and your team feel as though if Donald Trump prepares for the second debate exactly the way that he prepared for the first debate, he'll be golden. We're very confident going into the next two debates. And if you look at the last debate, if you look at Monday's debate, Hillary Clinton again tried to lie to the American people about the TPP. She lied about New York crime rates. She lied about not saying super predator about African American youth. And she was robotic. She was, she was very scripted. Who won the debate? I think Donald Trump won the debate. I think he continued the trajectory of this race.
4 weeks ago, the Republican Party was said to be in panic, and Trump was going to bring the whole thing down. Then he had a great 2 weeks. She had a bad 2 weeks. Then the debate happened. Where is your party now in terms of comfort with Trump at the top of the ticket and his chances?
I think that most Republican leaders I talk to believe that Hillary has an edge. It's close. She has an edge. She'll probably win. But right now, the win won't be so decisive that it will do a lot of damage down ballot. That's just sort of that's anecdotal. I mean, that's just when I talk to people, that's the view.
90% of Republicans are with Donald Trump. Yeah. In Pennsylvania, this is interesting. In Pennsylvania, about a week and a half ago, Morning Consult said that 71% of the Pennsylvania Republicans were behind Trump. Right. Now, in just 1 week, 85, a 14% swing.
How potent is the message that he dabbled in the debate that you've been part of the Washington problem for 30 years. We need a change. How potent is that?
With 70% saying things are on the wrong track, message-wise, if any of us were actually talking about the message, it might be powerful. But if he does 2 more debates where basically his temperament gets in the way and he doesn't appear qualified, this thing is going to snowball in her direction. If he bounces back, and look, if after the next debate we're actually talking about, wow, maybe we need a change, maybe he could do it, maybe let's look at these tax cut plans. What do you think, trade? If we're actually talking about any of that, that actually would help
trade
Donald Trump.
First half hour, right? Yeah. So we could be talking about trade. Here's what I don't think is going to happen.
That's not what we're talking about. Let me just say, there's a snowball of stories coming out of the debate. It's not substantive.
I'd love
it's
to talk
about the 2 people.
I actually thought the first 20 minutes were effective. The question is, he started talking about the anthropology of birtherism. He talked about who called Sean Hannity to confirm Iraq. He attacked this woman about her weight. So do you think he should have just stayed off those topics?
That's good of you to bring up, because the reason those issues came up is because that's what the moderator asked about. So, and the next 2 debates, no way she is.
Wait a second. So there's constantly in politics, both campaigns say, we want to talk about the issues. The other side wants to talk about nonsense. Listen to what Donald Trump said just a few minutes ago out on the trail in Iowa.
All those day offs, and then she can't even make it to her car. Isn't it tough?
So he's back to talking about 9/11. Who here thinks that's a good line?
That's part argument. Of a larger speech. Another thing he said in the speech is follow the money, and talk about all the money she's taking.
Yeah. But let's just talk about this issue, right? You think it's a smart move for your boss to be basically impugning Hillary Clinton's health again, saying she couldn't make it to her car.
Stamina is a big part of the requirement to be president, and that's, again, you took one line of that speech. Another line, did, but there are a lot of lines in the speech. One of them is follow the money, and that's what the speech was concentrated on.
You're absolutely right about that. And we don't want to suggest that was all he said today, but it does go to this issue. You come here and say, and again, the Clinton people do the same thing. We want to talk about issues and substance, the things that affect the American people. You're saying she couldn't make it to her car when she had pneumonia.
But this is a good example of why we talk about, you know, a subset of issues, is because we're not talking about the other things he discussed in the speech. He discussed taxes. He discussed
he wants
trade.
people to focus on those issues. He should not make these kind of comments that he knows that you know full well are what are going to get the attention. If he attacks her health, people are going to pay attention to that. You know that.
It's a comment. It's an observation.
So you want to talk about issues? You want to talk about her health?
Wait, I'll talk about anything you want to. I prefer to talk about issues.
Can I just say, like you, I've been involved with a lot of campaigns. It's typically a bad sign when people like you and me come onto every television show. And I see it not just with you, I see it with other surrogates for the Trump campaign. And their explanation for everything is the media is asking us unfair questions. Well, that's what you've been saying. You're saying the media is focusing on things while your campaign just wants to focus on the issues.
No, what I'm saying is this. What I'm saying is, first of all, what I was trying to say earlier about the debates is, next 2 debates, no way Hillary Clinton doesn't get to talk, doesn't have to answer for emails, Libya, Clinton Foundation. And again, about the issues, I would love if the next question was, what's the corporate tax bracket going to be like?
Mark, let me ask you this question, just because the issue of stamina has just come up, and Boris suggests that Hillary Clinton doesn't have much stamina. There were a fair number of people who watched that debate who seemed to think Hillary Clinton stood upright at the podium and was very strong for 95 minutes, while Donald Trump seemed to kind of fade through the debate. What was your perception of the relative stamina of the 2 candidates?
I thought she did have more stamina, and it was completely ridiculous of Trump to say that when the living contradiction of what he was saying was right there. Now, she had a bad video, she had stuff that happened, but on that day and that moment, and even today, what is he doing? Why does he think? He obviously thinks that's a great strategy. You know, I don't know what poll would show that.
Who do you think looked like they had better stamina on Monday night at the debate?
I really did think she did. I'm not just saying that because I'm biased against Trump. I'm not biased in favor of Hillary Clinton. I thought that she was energetic. I thought she was, brimming with sort of optimism. I thought when she went on the attack against him, she was almost better on the attack than she was talking about her own ideas. I don't think she was that effective ultimately in talking about her policies. But when she would prosecute him, it was concise, it was succinct, it was powerful. When she asked him why he didn't pay taxes, or why wouldn't he reveal his tax returns, when he basically revealed that he pays no taxes and he's smart, and she listed the 4 reasons why someone would withhold holding. What did he say?
That's not what he said. What he said was that if you follow the tax code in a way that does minimize how much you have to pay within rules and regulations, that's fine. And now as far as...
Well, just be clear. She said you pay... One scenario is you pay no taxes, and he said that's because I'm smart.
No, he said that's called being smart at a time...
I think the literal read of what he said, you're right, but in a debate in the back and forth, I don't think he meant
obvious
literally.
That's what he meant. What he was saying is, when I've paid paid a lesser amount in taxes per the tax code. That's smart. I'm sure you do the same as a businessman. I'm sure Mark does. I'm sure all of us do. But hold on. Let me answer something. She had, what, 5 days off beforehand? I was with him on Thursday. We flew out early in the morning. Pittsburgh, 2 stops. Philadelphia, I think 3 stops. On and on and on every day through Saturday. He was in Virginia at a huge rally on Saturday. Maybe she was a little more rested, but yeah, because she had 5 days off. But again, we are now focusing on, who took time off, who took...
No. She did not have time off.
What did she do all the previous week?
She went to school. See, and Donald did not go to school.
He was working hard for
Donald has to go to school if he's going to be president. And when America says he didn't go to debate school, he just showed up, is he going to go to school to really be president? He undermines
authenticity is what America.
What are the 3 biggest things in Trump's favor to win this election?
The 3 biggest things are 70% think the country's in the wrong direction, 60% think both candidates are untruthful and don't like either of them, and there are a lot of angry voters out there, particularly white male voters, who really support him and are enthusiastic of him. Those are the 3 best things for him.
How big a danger is Gary Johnson to her winning?
I don't think it'll be decisive. I think in the end, as long as Johnson is not in the debates, which is not in the debates, I think it'll fade in the end, won't be a big factor.
Boris, just to clarify the tax thing for real quick, are you prepared here to say on camera that you know unequivocally that Donald Trump has paid federal income taxes the past few years? That you know that.
Mr. Trump has always followed all rules and regulations.
So, Boris, you're prepared to say you know for a fact that he's paid federal income tax the past few years?
I'm not his tax attorney. I'm not his tax.
So it's possible he did. It's possible what every minute of the debate he did.
What I'm saying to you.
So far, no one in the campaign has been willing to say we know that he's paid federal taxes. No one said that.
What I know is that he's followed all rules and regulations. Something else I know is that he wants to simplify the tax code, 3 tax brackets, 12, 25, and 33, lower the corporate tax bracket, and know from 35 to 15. And those are the taxes that people care about at home.
Prep? This is a pretty good answer.
Yeah, but couldn't he say this? No, Boris. Couldn't he say, look, I try to minimize my taxes, and that to me is being smart. But of course, I've paid federal income taxes over the years. Why can't he say that?
It's up to him what he says, right? His taxes are under audit. We've said that repeatedly. He said that repeatedly. And the bottom line here is this, that as a businessman, as a smart businessman, of course you will pay what the tax code says.
I know, but what he should have said was, I've paid every single cent due to the United States government, including the taxes on my thousands and thousands of employees on my properties. I mean, I'm sorry.
Unless, of course,
Mark wants to hang out on the.
Unless, of course, that's not true.
Thank you, Boris. Thank you, Dan. Thank you all. Please come back. And when we come back, a look behind the scenes of Hillary Clinton's campaign, both north and south. And if you're watching us in Washington, D.C., you can listen to the program every day on the radio at Bloomberg 99.1 FM. We will be right back.
As you probably know, Mark and I do some work on another television program called The Circus, which is our Showtime documentary series in conjunction with Bloomberg Politics. That airs every Sunday night at 8 p.m. Eastern. Recently, we got a chance to sit down with two key players in the Clinton campaign, Florida State Director Simone Ward, and not far from here in Brooklyn, at Clinton's Brooklyn headquarters, a director of regional communications, Lily Adams.
So we're about to go to a meeting right now with Lily Adams and her team. They run communications for the battleground states. Lily has now been with the Clinton campaign from the very beginning. Her grandmother was Ann Richards, fiery, famous Democratic governor of Texas. Her mother is Cecile Richards, who runs Planned Parenthood and is one of the most important progressive activists in the country. Voters, they get most of their news through local news. And so the group that Lily works with here, these guys are out there kind of in the trenches, fighting vote by vote, market by market, station by station to try to make sure that they can win in states where the margin's going to be really, really small.
I just wanted to go over sort of how yesterday went, how the Philly coverage looks.
I mean, it was obviously difficult because the terrorist bombing, but Hillary did the millennial speech at Temple, led the news, the evening news, got a couple front pages.
We have 13 radio interviews today, both in North Carolina, Florida,
right.
and throughout all of the battleground states, focusing in on urban radio.
Can we just make sure that for all the state radios that they're doing, that they have the registration deadlines? That'd be great.
Just talk about the way in which your relationship to your family kind of animated your interest in politics from an early age.
My grandmother ran for governor in 1990, and I was on the campaign trail starting from the beginning. To me, she's just, she's sort of always a presence. The secretary reminds me of her a lot. She doesn't complain, which was certainly a hallmark of my grandmother's time in office. She never complained about things being harder or tougher or trying to break up a good old boys club. She just kept going, and it would infuriate her critics, and it would rally her her supporters.
The battleground states have tightened, nationally tightened. Yeah. So just to kind of describe in which the environment that you work in, what that has felt like.
I think part of it is telling the teams in the states you got to have blinders on. They call these states battlegrounds for a reason, and we prepared for a competitive race in every single one of them. You know, Barack Obama won Florida by less than a percentage point. It's going to be a very close state. I don't think anyone is preparing for a landslide. We're preparing for us to have to work for it.
This is Hillary Clinton's state headquarters here in Tampa. There's no sign that Hillary Clinton's headquarters is here. The sign on the door leading inside says employee vendor entrance. I don't even know what that means, but it is a nondescript building. Given their votes are over the state, what is the significance of the vote in the I-4 corridor?
The I-4 corridor is really a good example of America, right? Florida in general, but the reality being that there are middle class and working class voters here. There are people from Puerto Rico. There are people that are African American. There's a large scale millennial population up and down the I-4 corridor, and it's a really good melting pot of every sort of, you know, cosmic blend, if you will, of voters across America, and in particular in Florida. And that's part of the reason why we're here based in Tampa, because it's a good example of all of the voters that we need to connect with.
All right, you mentioned millennials. I want to tell you about some millennials I just talked to over in Ybor City.
Yeah, Ybor, you got it.
So I was in a coffee shop talking to two 24-year-olds, one lifelong Floridian, one woman who's here in school from Wisconsin, both registered to vote here, both huge Bernie Sanders supporters.
Yep.
And both of them undecided about who they're going to vote for.
Yep.
They're totally uninterested in Donald Trump.
Yep.
They're not even that interested in Gary Johnson. They know much about him. But if they vote for Hillary Clinton, it will be with little to no enthusiasm. Is that something you've confronted? Is that a problem?
I think we are definitely working very hard to get the millennial vote. We're feeling pretty confident about where we are at the same point that President Obama was 4 years ago. We're very lucky to have Senator Sanders have endorsed us. He's out on the campaign trail talking to voters, talking to people that were supporting him in the primary.
And I said that to him. I said, doesn't the fact that Senator Sanders is so enthusiastic? So you are a well-practiced veteran spokesperson. This is the question on which I'm going to try to break through your veneer of discipline.
All right.
I mean, it just seems to me like if I were running Hillary Clinton's campaign in Florida, I would, and I was sitting with those 24-year-olds, I'd say, like, what's wrong with you people? Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders are same issue positions on tons of things. Senator Sanders enthusiastically for her. Like, how can I not have your votes banked?
Right. Well, I think the reality is you have to work for every vote. And we're not going to take that for granted. And I won't pretend that we don't have work to do. We need those 24-year-olds to be voting for us, just like they were supporting Bernie Sanders in the primary. And that's why Secretary Clinton is asking for their vote.
Our thanks to Lily Adams and Simone Ward. You can catch The Circus on Showtime Sundays at 8 p.m. Eastern. We will talk about one of the biggest tells in presidential politics when we come back.
Over the past few weeks, as Hillary Clinton's fortunes have ebbed and flowed, we've noticed one way you can decipher how the candidate, or at least her team, is feeling about how the race is going. Our tip is this: look at the handsome face of her traveling press secretary, Nick Merrill. A few weeks in the run-up to the debate, things weren't going so well for Hillary Clinton. Merrill, constant presence behind her when she talked to the press, and we'd usually have the face we call Sad Nick. Well, after the debate, things have changed. Hillary Clinton is on a roll. She's in a good mood, and so is Happy Nick. And you can tell if you see Hillary Clinton speaking to the press, generally Nick Merrill's behind her, and just look to see if you're getting Sad Nick or Happy Nick.
You know, we deal with, people think that the people we deal with on the staffs of presidential campaigns lie to us and try to spin us all the time. Sometimes they do try to lie to us and try to spin us. But, you know, you look at their faces and you can often tell what the truth is if you pay attention.
There's a scene in the documentary Wiener where Huma Abedin is telling an aide who's leaving their apartment, put on a happy face because the press is watching. Nick Merrill decides he wants to tell us what's going on, and that's good. It's helpful. Thanks, Nick. We'll be right back.
Head on over to BloombergPolitics.com right now for the latest installment of our Battleground 2016 series. This week, Sasha Eisenberg and Steve Yassino break down Hillary Clinton's millennial math problem. We'll talk to them about that on the show before the end of this week for sure. Coming up on Bloomberg TV, a roundtable with venture capitalists.
Delicious.
That is on Bloomberg West. It's going to be incredible. Until tomorrow, from Mark and me here in New York City, we say to you, sayonara.